On most maps, the stretch between Chestnut Hill and Germantown in northwest Philadelphia doesn't look like the kind of place where a young woman can simply disappear. It's row homes and churches, an arboretum, an old shuttered middle school, and a city that's noisy even when it's supposed to be quiet. It's where 23-year-old Kada Scott lived, worked, and moved through her days in a way her family later called predictable. Work, home, phone, online, never off the grid, never out of touch. That's the baseline you need to hold in your head, because everything that happens next makes sense only if you understand this. Kada was not someone who just walks away. By early October 2025, she was doing what lots of 23-year-olds in Philly do, picking up shifts in care work, staying late, answering her phone. Her family told reporters the same thing over and over. If she wasn't answering, something was wrong. That's why the timestamp on Saturday, October 4th, 2025 matters so much. That night she finished work in northwest Philly, and instead of getting into her car and driving home, she got into another vehicle. A key detail detectives later pieced together from cameras and phone data. She was last known to be alive right there, in her own city, surrounded by people, within minutes of major streets. And then nothing. No calls. No posts. No card use. A hard blackout. What investigators would later say, and we'll get to their names in later parts, is that in the days just before she vanished, Kata had been getting a series of persistent, even harassing calls connected to someone she knew. That detail shows up again in court documents and in the medical examiner timeline because it tells you two things at once. One, she wasn't randomly grabbed off the street, and two, whoever met her that night most likely arranged it in advance. This was contact, not coincidence. Philadelphia police treated it as a young woman who should be answering her phone, but is first, a missing person pattern. When her family reported her missing, officers from the northwest part of the city started with the obvious. Check the job, check the route, pull nearby cameras. But very fast, within days, the search rippled outward to Awbury Arboretum and the wooded area near it, because phone and video evidence suggested that the car connected to her disappearance went there not long after she left work. That's how a local missing person case suddenly had TV cameras filming lines of officers in the trees at Awbury, and Deputy Commissioner Frank Vanor telling reporters this was all in relation to the search for 23-year-old Kata Scott. The police weren't searching a forest at random. Tech and timeline had already pushed them there. Here's the thing about this case, and it's why we're telling it like an investigation and not just a tragedy. Every step forward happened because somebody added one more small piece. A camera angle, a license plate, a phone ping, an employee who remembered which car was left in the lot, a family member who said, "She would have called me." That kind of micro-evidence is fragile. People forget. Footage gets recorded over, weather washes things away. So if you were in northwest Philly the night of October 4th, around Germantown, Awbury, or near the old Ada H. Lewis Middle School, and you remember a dark car waiting where it normally doesn't, or you saw police taping off parts of the Arboretum later that week, or you saved a ring clip you never sent in, those are exactly the details detectives in real cases beg for. Drop it in the comments. Tell us where you were or what time your camera caught traffic. We're walking through this case piece by piece, the same way they did. Because, and this is the frame for the whole series, what starts here as a 23-year-old woman didn't come home will, over the next days, pull in homicide detectives, the DA's office, and eventually a named suspect tied to a previous kidnapping in the same year. That escalation doesn't happen unless the early facts are solid. So part 1 is the foundation. A young woman who was reliable goes missing after leaving work. Her car stays behind. Her phone goes silent. And police are led to a specific pocket of northwest Philadelphia to look for her. Everything else, the arrest, the burned car, the shallow grave behind an abandoned school, sits on top of this night. In the next part, we'll slow down the evening of October 4th itself. The calls, the route, and how a meeting that was supposed to be quick became the last time anyone saw her alive. October 4th, 2025 in northwest Philadelphia didn't start as a crime scene. For Kada Scott, it was just another overnight shift at the terrace at Chestnut Hill, the senior living facility where she'd been picking up hours. Staff there told police the same detail early on. She arrived, and then left again far too quickly, maybe 20 minutes, Deputy Commissioner Frank Vanor said later. That's the first red flag in the timeline, because overnight workers don't just clock in and bounce unless something pulls them back outside. In the days before that shift, family and friends said she'd been getting repeated, annoying, even harassing calls. That's not gossip. Police themselves briefed media that the case was bumped to the homicide unit partly because of those calls, plus the sudden silence on her phone and socials. The national outlets picked up the same line. She told friends she was being harassed, and then she vanished. So when you look at that 20-minute window, the simplest reading is the most chilling. One of the people who had been pushing into her day on the phone got her to come back outside. Here's what investigators reconstructed. Shortly after she arrived for the night shift, Kata walked back out to the parking area. Her own car stayed right there at the facility, unlocked from the outside world, which is why the family knew instantly that she didn't just leave. People who walk away from their lives usually take their car. People who meet someone, especially someone insistent, will get into their car. Cameras and phone data later showed that she got into another vehicle and rode off. That other vehicle, detectives say, ties back to 21-year-old Keon King, the man who, 2 weeks later, would be standing in a courtroom on kidnapping, arson, tampering, and after the medical examiner spoke, murder charges. King, according to the DA's office, wasn't some random stranger cruising past a care facility. He was already on their radar because of an earlier 2025 kidnapping case that had fizzled when the victim didn't appear. And when police matched up phones, messages, and vehicles in the Kata investigation, his name rose straight to the top. Prosecutors later said her messages to him, including the unnerving "kidnap me again" line reported by tabloid outlets, showed prior contact and a dynamic that wasn't brand new on October 4th. It tells you the meeting that night was arranged, not improvised. After she got into that car, phones and cameras start pulling us southeast across the map. Not back to her house. Not toward Center City. The route that matters runs down toward Awbury Arboretum and the wooded land behind the vacant Ada H. Lewis Middle School, the exact place where, 2 weeks later, 300 recruits, homicide detectives, canine teams, and even the school district's PR people would be standing over a shallow grave. Police didn't pick that spot out of a hat. They were following the electronic echo of the car that picked her up. There's another moving piece the public sometimes skips over: the stolen Hyundai Accent. Investigators told reporters they believe King stole that car the night before and used it in the chain of events. The pickup, the transport, and then later the burn, which is why he was hit with arson, causing a catastrophe, conspiracy, and related offenses even before the murder charge landed. That car was found burned and, disastrously for forensics, crushed before crime scene techs could get everything from it. And the DA has openly said that's why they think someone helped him after the fact. That's important for us, because it means this story might still have unnamed hands in it. So pause here and imagine the Friday night picture from street level. You live near Awbury or East Germantown. It's after 10 p.m. You see two cars where usually there's none by the back of the old school, maybe one dark, maybe a light-colored older Toyota, stopping where people mostly just cut through in the day. You hear doors, maybe raised voices, maybe a trunk. Then in the following nights, you hear about a car fire miles away. At the time it feels like nothing. Now we know it was the center of the case. If you were in that area on October 4th, 5, or even 6, and your porch cam or ring cam caught unfamiliar cars heading toward or away from the A to H. Lewis property, those are the exact fragments detectives piece together to tighten a timeline. Tell us in the comments what corner you live on, or what hour your camera records traffic. We're building the evening of October 4th exactly the way the real investigators did, from tiny, time-stamped clues. By the time her family called in the missing person report on October 5th, the case was already one step harder. Her phone had gone dark. No pings, no socials, no card swipes. For a 23-year-old in 2025, that's not maybe she needed space. That's something stopped her. And that's why, just over a week later, when Philadelphia police left the scene at the school empty-handed, and then suddenly came back on a very specific tip, and found her in a shallow grave, everyone from the DA to the school district to the city council started talking about this case in the language of preventable violence. The night call had become a homicide. In Part 3, we'll stay in those first 72 hours, how patrol officers, then the homicide unit, then even the FBI got layered on, and why that abandoned school became the beating heart of the search. When the call first reached Philadelphia police on Sunday, October 5th, 2025, it was logged the way thousands of calls are logged every year. A 23-year-old woman, Kada Scott, didn't come home after work. At that hour, it was still a family's problem, not a city's problem. But the patrol officers who spoke to her parents heard two things that flip a case fast. Her car was still at the job, and her phone was dead. For a young woman who always answered, as her mother told reporters, that is not lifestyle, that is interruption. That is why, inside of the first 72 hours, this stopped being maybe she left and became, in Deputy Commissioner Frank Vanor's words, a troubling missing person report. The first sweep is always the same. Detectives from the Northwest Division go to where she was last seen, the assisted living facility in Chestnut Hill, and start pulling the immediate circle in. Who saw her come in? How long did she stay? Who saw her go back out? Security confirmed the detail we talked about in Part 2. She left after only a short time and did not take her own vehicle. That one fact told investigators two things at once. She meant to come right back, and she trusted, or at least knew, the person she left with. Random abductors don't wait outside care homes for 20 minutes. People who have been calling and calling you do. Within that same window, officers started doing what you never see on viral clips, but is the backbone of real missing person work: camera canvassing. They walked and drove the blocks between the facility, Awbury Arboretum, and the stretches around the vacant A to H. Lewis Middle School, asking churches, corner stores, and row home owners for access to CCTV and ring footage for the nights of October 4th, 6. They weren't guessing the area, phone data, and a sighting had already nudged them toward Awbury by Friday, October 10th, which is exactly when TV crews caught them in the trees there. But here's the part that looked odd to the public. They searched that school and the woods more than once. On the first passes, police, canine, even New Jersey State Police dogs, they didn't find her. Vanor later said plainly, "We had been out here before, so why go back?" Because the digital trail cell tower hits, the path of the stolen Hyundai Accent tied to 21-year-old Keon King, the appearance of a second vehicle, a light-colored older Toyota in the same zone, kept circling that property. By the second week, the evidence was more stubborn than the landscape. That's why the city shut down the police academy and sent roughly 300 recruits to comb that same patch of overgrown Philadelphia, where the school board hadn't mowed in years. They were chasing the data, not their hunch. At the same time, the district attorney's office started to speak up, unusually early for what was still, on paper, a missing person case. DA Larry Krasner and prosecutors like Ashley Toxilowski told the cameras they were already looking at one man, Keon King, because his phone was in locations connected to this case, because he had contact with her right before she vanished, and because earlier in 2025 he'd been accused of kidnapping and strangling another woman. That case reopened the minute he appeared in Kata's. That is the moment the story stopped being maybe foul play and became, we have a suspect with a pattern. But police still lacked one thing, a member of the public willing to be specific. On the weekend of October 18th, that arrived. First there had been a vague tip, "She's back there." Officers checked, found nothing. Then came the second call, the one First Deputy Commissioner John Stanford would later call, very specific, giving them the angle on the woods behind Ada H. Lewis. They went back, this time with numbers, dogs, homicide, and a target, and in a shallow grave in the heavy growth they found human remains believed to be Kada Scott. The next day, DNA from her parents made it official. 2 weeks after she walked out to the parking lot, the city finally knew where she was. So here's where you come in quietly. Those first 72 hours only worked because people let detectives look at their cameras and because someone somewhere picked up the phone the second time and said, "No, really here." If you live near Awbury Arboretum, Chew Ave, East Haines, or the blocks backing onto Ada H. Lewis and your footage from October 4th, 7 shows 2 vehicles stopping where they shouldn't, a dark car first, then an older light-colored Toyota. That's the kind of clip that can firm up the transport timeline, or even show whether a second person was out there, which the DA now believes. Drop what you remember below. Tell us what hour your system records. Tell us if police already knocked. We're reconstructing the search in the same layered way they did. In Part 4, we'll shift from the ground search to the evidence problem, the burned car, the compacted vehicle, and why prosecutors keep saying, "We think he had help." If you look at the Kada Scott case from the outside, it feels fast. She vanished October 4th. Police named a suspect October 15th. Her body was found October 18th. But inside the investigation, there was a problem slowing everything down. The main piece of physical evidence had been set on fire and then crushed. That's why, when the district attorney's office finally laid out the charges on October 20th, 23, you kept hearing the same 4 words: arson, causing a catastrophe. They weren't just punishing property damage. They were telling you someone tried very hard to erase what happened to Kada. Here's the sequence prosecutors described. Just before midnight on October 3rd, one day before Kada disappeared, 21-year-old Keon King allegedly stole a Hyundai Accent that a delivery driver had left running and unattended. That's in the charging documents and repeated across local TV. He now has a whole stack of counts tied to that one decision. Why steal a car the day before meeting Kada? Investigators say, because he didn't want to use a traceable vehicle to pick her up. That accent, they believe, is the same one used to meet her outside her workplace and then carry her toward Awbury/Ada H. Lewis the next night. So from the start, the vehicle was not transportation. It was a tool to make the rest of the crime harder to prove. But very soon after the abduction, that Hyundai turns up burned, and fatally for forensics, compacted before crime scene techs could really work it. That detail shows up in both AP and Philly reports. The car tied to King and to Kata was found burning and was crushed before full examination, which is exactly the kind of thing that makes homicide detectives start using phrases like, "We believe he had help." You don't usually go from stolen car to completely destroyed car in such a short window without more than one pair of hands, or at least someone providing the location tools. DA Larry Krasner said straight out that investigators were looking at others who may have assisted after the fact. That's the evidence problem in this case. Police already had the digital trail, phones, texts, "Call me when you hear," tying King to Kata. What they almost lost was the physical trail that proves where she was taken and in what condition. Burning a car kills trace DNA, hair fibers, even some blood evidence. Crushing it turns a possible crime scene into scrap metal. And yet, even after that, prosecutors still added arson, conspiracy, tampering with evidence, theft and robbery on top of kidnapping. That tells you they recovered enough from what was left. And crucially, they had surveillance and cell tower records to fill the gaps the fire created. Modern cases survive bad scenes if the tech is good. There's another piece many viewers miss: a second car. Alongside the burned Hyundai, investigators were also chasing an older light gold Toyota Camry tied to King's address. Multiple outlets said police found it damaged and towed it under warrant, believing it also appeared in the area of the abandoned school where Kata's belongings, a card with her name, an iPhone case, were discovered. Why does that matter? Because two cars at the same location open the door to two people being on scene, which is why police and the DA keep inviting anyone who helped move or dispose of evidence to think very carefully about their exposure. If you live on a block backing onto Ada H. Lewis, or you have alley cameras that face the school and you saw two vehicles late on Oct. 4, 6, not 1, that is exactly the kind of micro-confirmation detectives use to prove accomplices. Drop the date, time, and direction in the comments. We're trying to rebuild vehicle movement in that 72-hour window. What makes this part of the story so infuriating for Philadelphians is that the alleged arson didn't just hide evidence. It almost delayed justice. NBC 10 and 6, ABC, both reported that King was already in custody on the kidnapping when the body was found, and that the murder charge had to wait on the medical examiner to finish, because the scene work was harder than it should have been. In other words, someone tried to burn and crush the timeline, too. And yet on October 22nd, 23, Krasner, Deputy Commissioner Frank Vanor, and homicide detectives still came out and said, "We're charging him with murder, abuse of corpse, and more." That's how strong the non-burnable part of the case was: the phones, the video, the witnesses, the pattern from January 2025. So as we keep building this like a documentary case file, here's the quiet ask. If you work in or around tow yards, scrap yards, auto recycling spots in Northwest/North Philly, and in the second week of October 2025, you logged a burned Hyundai Accent tied to a police hold, or you remember who actually towed it or who called it in, note it below. Prosecutors are already saying conspiracy and causing a catastrophe. Identifying the whole disposal chain is how they turn that from a theory into people in court. Even a time range on the tow, helps them align their footage. We're reconstructing the part of the story the fire was supposed to erase. In Part 5, we'll turn to the man at the center of all of this, Keon King, and the earlier kidnapping case that should have put him on the sidelines long before he ever called Kata. By the time Philadelphia homicide detectives put handcuffs on 21-year-old Keon King on October 15, 2025, he wasn't a stranger to the system. He was a name that had already moved through it once that same year and slipped out. Back in January 2025, according to the DA's office, King was accused of grabbing a woman outside her North Philadelphia home, forcing her into a car, assaulting and strangling her. And it was all so clear that there was video of him at the door telling her to come out. But when the case reached court, the woman and a key witness didn't appear, the charges were dropped, and King walked. That January case is the shadow hanging over Kata's case. Prosecutors are now saying it out loud. If that first victim had felt safe enough to testify, or if the system had protected her harder, King might not have been on the street in October. DA Larry Krasner said, "We are not done," even before the murder charge was filed, because the Scott investigation gave them leverage to reopen the January kidnapping and show a pattern of stalking, forced transport, and then trying to make the victim disappear from the record. When detectives overlaid the January file with Kata's October disappearance, the parallels were nasty. A young woman targeted where she lived or worked, a man who kept showing up or calling even after being told to go away, and a vehicle, his vehicle, not hers, being used to remove her from the scene. The New York Post even ran the January doorbell video in mid-October to show people exactly how he behaved. Leaning in, peering through windows, coming back again, and in that earlier case, allegedly abducting the woman an hour later. That's not an opportunist. That's someone willing to circle back. So when officers told reporters they were confident in naming King in the Kada Scott case even before the medical examiner ruled it a homicide, that confidence came from stacked behavior, from January, from the October phone records, and from the way the stolen Hyundai and later the gold 1999 Toyota Camry kept appearing in the same geography where Kata was last traced. Add to that the text messages investigators described, including the one from Kata saying, "Kidnap me again," which prosecutors believe shows previous contact rather than a random abduction. And you get why, on October 22, 23, the charges jumped all the way up to murder, robbery, abuse of corpse, tampering, arson, and conspiracy, with no bail. What's important for us, telling this like a documentary, is that police and the DA are still hinting at others after the fact. Why? Because in January there was video, a victim, and still the case didn't stick. In October there was a burned and compacted car, something that usually takes more than one person to arrange that quickly. Krasner's team is now doing what they should have been able to do 10 months earlier. They're saying to other women, if he did something like this to you, tell us now. Because once you can prove he's done it more than twice, it stops being a question of maybe he panicked and becomes, this is his method. NBC 10 and ABC both reported that officials are still asking the public for tips and for any other victims of King to come forward. If you were approached, followed, or coerced into a car in North or Northwest Philly this year by a young man driving a gold Camry with front left damage or a borrowed stolen small sedan, your piece matters more than you think. Drop when and where. We can connect it to the October map. Because that's the hard truth in Part 5. Kata's case did not start with Kata. It started with a man whose first alleged victim vanished from the courtroom, and so he was free to find a second. The October investigation is, in a way, trying to fix January. And if there's a third encounter out there that never got reported, a parking lot confrontation, a come outside call, a ride you didn't want to take. Putting it on the record now helps close the circle. DA Krasner says he wants closed. We're collecting the offender's pattern here the same way detectives are, by lining up dates, cars, and locations. In Part 6, we'll move to the place that made this case explode citywide, the abandoned Ada H. Lewis Middle School, and how one neglected building became the perfect cover for someone who already knew how to make evidence disappear. When detectives finally said out loud where they'd found her, in a shallow grave behind the vacant Ada H. Lewis Middle School, people in East Germantown didn't ask where. They asked why it took a murder for anyone to care about that building. The school has been closed since 2008, a 187,000 square foot hulk across from the Awbury Recreation Center, ringed by trees thick enough to swallow a person, a car, or, for 2 terrible weeks in October 2025, the body of 23-year-old Kada Scott. Neighbors told CBS and NBC the same thing. We've been telling the city for years this was a magnet for dumping and crime. Here is what happened on Saturday, October 18, 2025. Philadelphia police had already searched that property once and left with nothing. Then a second, far more precise anonymous tip came in. Deputy Commissioner John Stanford called it very specific. And they rolled back, this time with homicide, canine, and as many bodies as they could muster. In the wooded strip behind the school, not in the building itself, they found human remains in a shallow, quickly made grave. 14 days after she was last seen getting into a car at work, they had Kada. The next day, DNA and family ID confirmed it. The national headlines followed. The discovery blew the lid off something bigger than one case. Philadelphia has about 20 vacant school properties, and Ada H. Lewis was one of the least secured. Within 48 hours, council member Cindy Bass was on camera saying flatly that the school should be demolished or locked down because it had now been used to hide a murdered woman. The district, through spokesperson Monique Braxton, rushed to say the site was on their list and was being monitored, but the pictures that day showed something else. Crews suddenly clearing brush, boarding openings, hauling away trash after a body had been found there. Even the superintendent said protocols would be reviewed. This wasn't just a crime scene, it was proof of neglect. For investigators, though, the location did something useful. It shrunk the suspect's world. Whoever killed Kada knew about that property, knew it was big, dark, unlit, and that people were used to seeing unfamiliar cars stop near the rec center. It also sat exactly where her digital trail and the suspect vehicles were already pointing. The same pocket of Northwest Philly police had been combing at Awbury Arboretum just days earlier. When officers later said they believed more than one person may have helped move, burn, or dispose of evidence, this site was a big reason why. It's a place you drive to, not stumble on, and getting a body into that overgrowth is work. DA Larry Krasner was clear on this. There may have been accomplices after the fact. And then the neighborhood did what neighborhoods do when the system fails them. They turned the front of a dead school into a memorial. Balloons, photos, candles. More than 100 people came out to say her name right where she was found. That public grief is part mourning, part message. This didn't happen in the woods. It happened because a public building was left open long enough for someone to think it was a good place to bury a 23-year-old woman. WHYY and 6ABC both noted that people at the vigil weren't just crying. They were asking the city to secure all its vacant schools, not just this one. So here's our quiet fieldwork request for this part. If you live on Haynes-St. Chew Ave, Musgrave, or the blocks that back directly onto Ada H. Lewis and your camera, porch cam, or even your own eyes saw two separate vehicle visits to that rear tree line between late-night Oct. 4 and the morning of Oct. 6. First a dark small sedan, later an older light gold Toyota dropped the time and direction below. That's exactly the kind of micro-evidence detectives used to show that moving Kata and later destroying the Hyundai weren't one-man jobs. We're trying to reconstruct how an abandoned school became part of a homicide. In Part 7, we'll follow what happened after she was found, how the medical examiner's ruling turned kidnapping into murder, and how the community's anger kept pressure on everyone from the school district to the courts. The tone around the case changed on October 23, 2025. Up to that point, officials had been talking about remains believed to be and charges related to the disappearance. That day, the Philadelphia medical examiner ended the uncertainty. The woman found in the shallow grave behind the vacant Ada H. Lewis Middle School was 23-year-old Kada Scott, and she had been shot in the head. The manner of death, homicide. That single sentence unlocked the rest of the charges. Within hours, the man already sitting in jail on kidnapping, stalking, arson, and tampering, 21-year-old Keon King, was formally hit with murder and ordered held without bail. Police could finally say what they'd suspected since the first week. Kata didn't run, didn't overdose, didn't have an accident. Somebody killed her. Deputy Commissioner Frank Vanor posted that the department would continue to pursue justice for her. Not usual language for a case that already has a suspect, and not accidental. It signaled what DA Larry Krasner and WHYY both underlined the same day. Investigators still think someone helped after Kata was killed, because the stolen Hyundai was burned and crushed, because a second car tied to King showed up in the zone, and because a body in a shallow grave behind a giant vacant school is rarely the work of just one pair of hands. There may be accomplices, Krasner said, and he said it while the main suspect was already locked up. That tells you they were speaking to the people around King as much as to the public. Outside, the city was doing its own kind of work. More than 100 people, family, neighbors, activists, even state rep voices gathered right in front of the school where she was found. They brought balloons and candles, but they also brought microphones. One speaker said, "Her legacy is not in vain," and another said the district had ignored this property for years until a young woman's body forced cameras to come. That vigil wasn't only grief. It was evidence the community had been warning about the site long before October 18th. And the message clearly landed, because within 48 hours the district was sending crews to clear brush, and council member Cindy Bass was publicly calling to demolish or fully secure the building. A homicide had just turned into a policy fight. Meanwhile, reporters started pressing the DA on the question everyone was asking online. How was King out in October if he'd been accused of kidnapping and strangling a woman back in January? Krasner admitted in a Fox 29 availability that the earlier bail decision was not the correct decision, and Newsweek noted he came under fire for that dropped case once Kata was found. That's the other fallout of the ME's ruling. A missing person case can be treated like an unfortunate mystery. A gunshot homicide of a working 23-year-old turns into a referendum on who should have been locked up months earlier. So as we keep building this like an open file, here's the research style ask for this chapter. The ME has fixed the what gunshot to the head, and the police have fixed the who, King, in custody, no bail. What isn't fully fixed is the who else, and the how many times he tried something like this. If you live near Awbury, Ave, or the blocks behind Ada H. Lewis and any of your cameras from Oct. 4. 6 show more than one person getting out of a vehicle by that tree line, or show a tow utility truck near where a burned car could have been staged. Note the time and direction below. Even better, if you had an interaction with King earlier in 2025 that never made it into a report, put the month and general location. Prosecutors are clearly trying to show a pattern to close the gaps the arson created. We're doing what homicide did. Now that the cause of death is locked, we tighten the circle around everyone who touched the crime. In Part 8, we'll go inside the charging documents and first court appearance. How prosecutors built kidnapping right arrow, arson right arrow, tampering right arrow murder into one narrative. And how the defense is likely to challenge the text messages that seem so damning right now. When the homicide ruling came down on October 23, 2025, the case against 21-year-old Keon King moved from "we think he took her" to "we can tell a judge how he took her, where he took her, what he did to hide it, and why that makes this murder." That shift showed up immediately in the paperwork. Up to October 20th, King was sitting on a stack of kidnapping, stalking, unlawful restraint, arson, tampering with evidence and related offenses, all tied to the disappearance and to the burned Hyundai the DA says he used. Once the medical examiner said Kata died from a gunshot wound to the head and not an accident, the DA's office added the heavy artillery: murder, robbery, theft, abuse of corpse, obstruction of justice. ABC and CBS Philly both reported it the same way. The body is hers. We know how she died right arrow, he's now charged with killing her, and desecrating her body right arrow, he's held without bail. The logic of the prosecution is actually very clean, almost like a staircase. Step 1, he calls and meets her. They have prior contact, backed by messages, including the now viral "kidnap me again" line that prosecutors say proves she knew him, and he had done something similar before. Step 2, he uses a car he shouldn't even have, the stolen Hyundai Accent from October 3rd, to move her from her workplace to the Awbury/Ada H. Lewis zone. Step 3, that car is burned and compacted, an act which by itself is a felony, and more importantly, an admission that there was something in or on that car that could have pointed straight back at him. Step 4, her body is found where his phone and, at times, a second car tied to him were seen. At the bottom of that staircase sits the murder count. If you can show a judge he controlled the victim, controlled the transport, controlled the vehicle destruction, and was present at the burial site, murder becomes the natural top charge, not an add-on. That is why, at arraignment, the judge agreed with prosecutors and ordered him held without bail. But the courtroom wasn't one-sided. King came in with high-profile defense attorney Shaka Johnson, who has been doing something very specific in interviews. He's not arguing that Kata is alive. The remains are confirmed. He's arguing context. In his comments to local outlets, he said people should let the facts come out, and hinted that messages like "kidnap me again" can look very different when you see the whole thread, not the single line that made headlines. That's a preview of what a real trial strategy would be. Try to reframe the October 4th meetup as consensual contact between two people who already knew each other, and then force the DA to prove, with no full car forensics, exactly when and where the fatal shot was fired, and whether anyone else could have done it. That's the hole the burned car was meant to create, and the defense will drive straight at it. The DA knows that, which is why you see so many charges that sound like after the fact. Tampering with evidence, obstruction, abuse of corpse, arson, causing a catastrophe. They're not just punishing the fire. They're telling the judge, Your Honor, anything that is fuzzy in this file is fuzzy because the defendant tried to destroy it. That's powerful in front of a Philly judge. especially when you remind the court that this is the same defendant whose January 2025 kidnapping and strangulation case fell apart only because the victim didn't appear. That old case is now being reopened right alongside Kata's. The subtext is, we lost him once, we aren't losing him twice. There's also the timeline pressure. Local TV got hold of docket info showing a preliminary hearing date of November 3rd, 2025, which is fast for a homicide tied to arson. That speed tells you prosecutors think the phone records, license plate hits, and surveillance near Ada H. Lewis are strong enough to get this through the first gate even without the fully intact car. It also forces the defense to show its hand early, to tell the court whether they're attacking ID, attacking cause of death, or attacking the idea that King acted alone. So staying in our "we're building the file together" mode if you were in arraignment that day, or you work around the Philadelphia Criminal Justice Center and saw additional family members or supporters file motions, or you pulled the public docket and saw names of other individuals listed on the complaint, sometimes redacted in TV copies. Tell us what line number you saw and what charge it was next to. Even tiny details, a co-defendant slot left blank, a motion to preserve scrapyard video, a request for cell tower expert testimony, help us map what the lawyers think is weak, and that's exactly how documentary teams and cold case units deepen their timelines. We're trying to match what the DA did on October 23rd, turn a disappearance into a prosecutable story. In Part 9, we'll zoom out from the courtroom to the politics. How a single killing revived the debate over repeat violent offenders in Philly, put pressure on DA Krasner, and made an abandoned school a citywide embarrassment. By late October 2025, the Kada Scott case had stopped being just a crime story and turned into a mirror Philadelphia didn't like looking into. On paper it was clean. A 23-year-old woman leaves work, is picked up by someone she knows, disappears, is found 2 weeks later in a shallow grave, and that same someone, 21-year-old Keon King, is charged with kidnapping, arson, then murder after the medical examiner rules she was shot in the head. But once her name was confirmed, the questions coming from City Hall, from activists, even from neighborhood meetings weren't about the timeline anymore. They were, why was he free? Why was that school open? And how many times do black women in this city have to say, "I'm being harassed," before someone locks a door or raises a bail? Those were political questions, not detective questions. The first shockwave hit the school district of Philadelphia. Within a day of the discovery, cameras filmed crews cutting brush and boarding openings at the vacant Ada H. Lewis Middle School, the exact thing neighbors said they'd been begging for before a body was found there. Council member Cindy Bass sent a letter that basically said, demolish it or truly secure it now because the risks posed by this abandoned building are no longer hypothetical. The district had to admit on 6ABC and WHYY that Ada H. Lewis is only one of roughly 20 dormant properties they're reviewing protocols for. In other words, there are 19 more places in the city where someone with the same intentions as King could have done the same thing. That isn't just urban decay, that's an infrastructure gap that enabled a homicide. The second shockwave hit the district attorney's office. Reporters, especially AP and local TV, started putting two headlines next to each other. Remains of Kata Scott found, and suspect had previous kidnapping case dropped. DA Larry Krasner was already on camera saying there may have been accomplices, and that they were looking at anyone who helped burn or crush the Hyundai. But he also had to answer the harder political version. Why did the January 2025 strangulation kidnapping case against the same man fall apart so easily? Neighborhood folks heard only this: if that case had stuck, Kata might be alive. That's the kind of cause and effect that makes city councils start hearings. And then there was the broader Philadelphia story, the one about repeat violent offenders. NBC 10 and CBS Philly both framed it this way. King was out on the street despite a prior, very similar allegation. Then a young woman was abducted and murdered. Now the DA wants the public's help to find others who may have helped him. That sounds to a lot of residents like the system reacting after the worst outcome, not before it. That's why you suddenly saw state-level people and council members show up at the vigil. They weren't all there just to grieve. Some were there to be seen pushing for secured buildings, higher bails on violent cases, and resources for missing person investigations so families don't have to do half the work themselves. Here's where we can quietly help that process. The city is now under pressure on 3 fronts. 1. Which vacant buildings were flagged for security before October 18th. 2. Which judges and courtrooms handled King's January 2025 case that got dropped. And 3. Whether any 911 or non-emergency calls about harassing phone calls from early October were made and logged but not linked to Kata. If you work in or around the school district, the CJC, or even a neighborhood CDC, and you saw memos about Ada H. Lewis before the body was found, or you know of other vacant schools in Germantown, Logan, or West Oak Lane that are sitting open the same way, put the location and month below. That's exactly the kind of sourcing journalists, and yes, documentarians used to show a problem wasn't a surprise to the city. We're doing the civic legwork the case itself already forced officials to start. In Part 10, we'll close the circle. What justice could look like for Kata's family, what gaps in Philadelphia this case actually exposed, and what still isn't answered about the night she left work and got into the wrong car. When Philadelphia finally said it, this is a homicide. The body is Kada Scott. She was shot in the head. The case reached the point where facts stopped moving fast. The suspect, 21-year-old Keon King, is already in custody, now on murder, kidnapping, arson, tampering, robbery, abuse of corpse, and conspiracy, held without bail. That part is, for the moment, fixed. What isn't fixed, and what this whole 10-part story has been circling, is everything around it. The vacant school that stayed open until a woman was buried there, the January 2025 kidnapping that slipped through, and the unanswered question DA Larry Krasner keeps repeating himself. Were there others who helped after the fact? If you lay the timeline flat, it's brutally simple. Oct. 4, 2025. Kata leaves work after a short, odd shift and gets into the wrong car. Oct. 5/14. Family reports her missing. Police follow phones and cameras to Awbury and the woods behind Ada H. Lewis Middle School. A man she'd been messaging, the same man once accused of kidnapping and strangling another woman, is arrested on related charges. Oct. 18. A very specific, anonymous tip sends 300 recruits and homicide detectives back to the school, and they find her in a shallow grave. Oct. 23. The medical examiner rules. Gunshot to the head, right arrow homicide, right arrow murder chart. That's the spine. Everything else, the burned Hyundai, the damaged Camry, the DA admitting the earlier bail was not the correct decision, the council member urging the district to demolish the school, hangs off that spine. So what does justice even look like after that? First, it's individual. A full prosecution of King, with the January 2025 case reopened and placed beside Kata's to show pattern. The Thing 6, ABC, Fox 29, and Newsweek all said the DA is now trying to do. That's meant to fix the mistake that let him walk on 10% of $200,000 bond and stay free long enough to meet Kata. Second, it's structural. The school district following through on the reviewing protocols it promised once her body was found, and council actually forcing action on the 20 other vacant properties that could be used the same way. Cindy Bass's line, "The risks are no longer hypothetical," is the most accurate sentence anyone said in this whole story. Third, it's truth-finding, identifying whether anyone helped torch and compact the stolen Hyundai, whether anyone was in the second car, and whether any of King's earlier contacts in 2025 match the behavior in this case. That's why Krasner and Deputy Commissioner Frank Vanor keep saying they're continuing to pursue justice, even though the main suspect is already in a cell. They still don't have every pair of hands. And this is where you, the viewer, can still move the file. If you live or work near Awbury, Ave, Haynes, or the stretch behind Ada H. Lewis and your camera from Oct. 4, 6 shows 1, 2 vehicles instead of 1, 2, a tow scrap-style truck, or 3, a person walking in or out of that tree line alone at night. That's evidence the conspiracy count is right, not theoretical. If you were part of the school security emails or neighborhood complaints about that exact building before Oct. 18, say which month, proving the city was warned is how you keep another abandoned building from being used to hide another woman. And if you, like the unnamed January victim, had contact with King and didn't feel safe enough to stay in court, hearing that the DA has now refiled and is under public pressure might be the window to come forward now. We're doing this as research, but real detectives build cases exactly the same way. One more clip, one more log entry, one more person who finally talks. So the story of the missing Kada Scott doesn't really end at the grave behind the school. It ends when the man already charged is either convicted or exposed as part of something slightly larger. When the city has to report which vacant sites are actually secured. And when women in Philly who say, "Someone is harassing me," don't get told to just block the number. That was the gap this case exposed. And because this is still an active prosecution, anything you add now, location, date, footage, even the name of a junkyard that received a burned Hyundai that week, will land somewhere useful. Tell us what corner you're on and what your camera saw. We started this series with a night call. We can end it with a city that actually listens.